Okay, so we're getting a basic understanding of the progressives, the progressive movement, who the progressives were, what the movement was about. It's a rather complicated subject, as you've probably already seen. But before moving on to progressive figures of great importance and more specifics and detail about what progressives actually did and tried to do, I'm going to let two authors, two historians speak for themselves, kind of doing a point-counterpoint here. So progressivism at its best was, at least in part, about equal opportunity and justice. And the professor I've already quoted in A Fierce Discontent says, the progressive era remains quite fascinating. The people and struggles of that age of fierce discontent a century ago still command our attention. There is Theodore Roosevelt himself, the energy glinting through his pince-nez. Pince-nez are like a little kind of glasses. We'll see a picture of it later. As he urges Americans to punish the authors of evil. There are the women's suffragists marching in the streets to demand the vote. There are the determined anthracite coal miners quietly walking out in mass to demand recognition from their wealthy bosses. There is the calm courage of Jane Addams crossing the social boundaries of urban Chicago to improve and change the lives of her new immigrant neighbors. So this just gives us a smattering of some of the positive work and positive, encouraging results for the progressive movement. But there is a rather large downside, and this only covers kind of the most extreme part of the downside. And this, in this sense, the following passage that I'll read from another professor who has a more negative take on progressivism. This element in the progressive era, or progressive movement, I should say, in the beginning of the 20th century, has little in common with progressive thinking today. Progressives must look back at this feature of progressivism in the earlier century, or in the earlier decades, with horror. As Professor Gregg says, progressivism was heavily influenced by two particularly insidious ideologies. The first was eugenics, the idea that humanity's genetic health could be protected from bad breeding and even enhanced by purposeful social selection. The second was race science, which asserted that different races were intrinsically unequal in abilities. Race science relied heavily on the theory, now rejected, that humans developed out of several different pairs of ancestors. Reason and science, they believed, had opened the way to identify the fittest, whom government should favor through specific marriage, reproduction, labor, and immigration policies. In 1911, Woodrow Wilson, then governor of New Jersey, signed legislation forcing sterilization on what eugenicists regarded as the, quote, hopelessly defective and criminal classes, unquote. Other progressives wanted health care for black Americans to implement eugenic measures to improve the, quote, quality and diminish the number of black births. Such thinking also inspired measures such as minimum wage laws designed to exclude from the labor market Asian and Jewish migrants who might drag down the wages of supposedly more industrious Anglo-Saxons. Many progressives saw state-mandated family wages as a means of keeping Anglo-Saxon women at home. This, it was hoped, would reverse the declining Anglo-Saxon birth rates and protect America from being overrun by, quote-unquote, lesser peoples. So this is a downside, an ugly one indeed. But I think you can see here, or I'll at least remind you, that this already touches on some of the overall values and beliefs of progressivism that we've already talked about. So it gets back to, for instance, this idea that was prevalent among progressives in the progressive movement, that you can sort of change human nature. You can change the individual. You can change the human being. Again, there might be ways in which that could be seen as a positive and as something that brings about health and a better society. But this the idea of improving human beings was applied in this way through eugenics. You can improve racial characteristics, where you can weed out the wrong racial or ethnic, wrong in quotation marks, of course, racial and ethnic characteristics. So the idea that human beings are infinitely malleable and changeable, that we can sort of change them and improve them, depends on, again, what your view of improvement is. So this, what I just read, right, horrifying, way of thinking to our eyes and ears today, right? That this doesn't look like progress. This doesn't look like something that would be a positive result emanating from the idea that we can just change human beings however we see fit. There are some other ways for this quote and this very, very shameful side of progressive thinking fits some of the values we already talked about, but we'll come back to some of it later on. So from outside to inside, progressives in mainstream institutions. You see a couple of big name universities pictured there, where progressive social scientists did a lot of significant work. In The Tyranny of Change, Professor Chambers says, as they challenged established policies and office holders, progressives became key leaders in public and private organizations. Political parties, government, the media, and institutions and associations ranging from education to engineering. In these positions, they translated the reform spirit into an ideal and clusters of American beliefs into a powerful reform rhetoric that could mobilize millions of citizens to participate in campaigns for progress, portrayed as pitting the people against the interests, or the interests, it's supposed to say. So the main point here is that progressive ideas outside of institutions could only get so far, not very far, but once progressives became professors and administrators in universities, got into government agencies like administrative agencies, got elected to office, became scientists in influential labs, etc., then progressive ideas could become part of mainstream institutions, or were part of mainstream institutions at that point forward, and then had a greater chance, and did, actually affect the society through policy, and actually the ideas being implemented. So now let's meet the A-list progressives, which means the famous ones. And we don't have time to talk about all of them, but a smattering of the big names. And we'll start with the progressives that were politicians, and then we'll get to the progressives that were famous that weren't politicians. At least they weren't elected officials. Some of them certainly were engaged in political activity, political activism, but we'll start with the elected politicians, and then get to the well-known non-politicians, and we'll see that they kind of go across the gamut of professional life. So, what does progressivism even mean? In what way were these people progressive? I repeat the question because we have reason to come back to it again and again. Hopefully, we'll see some of the answers, or get an increasing picture of what this means as we see the lives and careers of some of the big name individuals. And who else would we start with but, yes, Theodore Roosevelt. So Roosevelt was a progressive politician. We've talked about his foreign policy already, so in some ways we're backtracking here. And we know his influence in that realm was particularly great, but it was also great in domestic policy as well. Roosevelt, as we know, came from a wealthy old money family in New York City. He rose through the ranks of local politics, police commissioner for a short time, before being appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy, as we've also already alluded to, and kept working his way up, eventually became governor of New York, before getting to the White House and the Oval Office through an assassination first. William McKinley, who picked Roosevelt as his running mate in his re-election bid, was actually shot and killed just into the early part of his second term. So Roosevelt, vice president, becomes president. He was elected in his own right in 1904, so he started the presidency as kind of a caretaker until the next election, but did win in 1904, which certainly had something to do with his personality and his ability, etc. So he's usually considered one of our most significant, and some would say one of our greatest presidents. There's some quotes here that I won't necessarily focus on. The last one is shows that he had a sense of humor. But Roosevelt, a Republican, was maybe the most important progressive Republican of the progressive era. And to show us that progressivism was the dominant ideology, right? This idea, for instance, that government needs to take a more active role in American society, to show you how widespread this was, how many Americans supported it and believed it, we only need to look at the next guy on our list, Woodrow Wilson, also a president later in the progressive era, but a Democrat of a progressive bent. So when we see that one president, Roosevelt, a Republican, was part of the progressive wing of his party, and Woodrow Wilson was leading progressive in the progressive wing of his Democratic Party, we see that this means that conservatives, liberals, and many other ways of identifying oneself politically were supportive of progressive views and progressive reforms. Woodrow Wilson is one of the most influential presidents in our entire history. We'll get to his foreign policy in our next unit on World War I, and that's part of the reason he's considered so important. But he had tremendous impact on the way domestic policy was done and the power of the presidency. His views on the president's role in American government and American society changed the presidency permanently, and they've become sort of entrenched ever since. So, and all of that leads to the question, then, were progressive views a good thing? Because he identified himself as a progressive, but he, among other things, is maybe the first president that pushes the idea of what detractors of progressive thinking call the administrative state today, which some, including the author of Liberal Reformers, calls the fourth branch of government. Administrative government bodies, chartered to be independent of their creators, uniquely endowed with legislative, executive, and judicial powers combined, which is somewhat true today. Whether or not this is a good or a bad thing, or maybe even overstated somewhat, there is no doubt a grain of truth in it. And even in the progressive era, there was some. I think it's even more true now. So, another way of looking at this says that Woodrow Wilson had a totally different way of thinking about not just the president's role, but the role of government and the Constitution. So this allows us to see further and more clearly how big an impact this guy had. He was looking to, and in many ways succeeded in radically changing, significantly altering American government. He said, "The trouble with the theory is that government is not a machine, but a living thing. It falls not under the theory of the universe, but under the theory of organic life. It is accountable to Darwin, not to Newton." It is modified by its environment, necessitated by its tasks, shaped to its functions by the sheer pressure of life. No living thing can have its organs offset against each other as checks, and live. He's criticizing checks and balances in the original Constitution. On the contrary, its life is dependent upon their quick cooperation, their ready response to the commands of instinct or intelligence, their amicable community of purpose. Government is not a body of blind forces. It is a body of men with highly differentiated functions, no doubt, in our modern day of specialization, but with a common task and purpose. Their cooperation is indispensable, their warfare fatal. There can be no successful government without leadership or without the intimate, almost instinctive coordination of the organs of life and action. What Wilson is getting at, and it may not be clear from the quote, keep in mind that Wilson, his background was as a professor. His background was in academia. He had been a political science professor at Princeton University before becoming president of Princeton, then going on to be governor of New Jersey, actually a fairly quick rise through those positions, before being elected president of the United States in 1912. But he's talking here about, when he says government basically is accountable to Darwin, not to Newton, he's saying that Newton's laws of gravity, right, a fixed, talking about that there are laws that explain how gravity works. They're fixed. They don't change. But Darwin's evolution, right, his evolutionary theory, is about change, gradual change over time. What he's saying in a very scholarly way here is something radical, at least at the time it was, and that is that government has to be changeable. It has to be flexible. It has to evolve and be fluid. It can't sort of, like Newton's law of gravity or laws of gravity, stay fixed. So what he's saying is that our constitutional system needs to adapt and evolve, which, again, could be a good thing. Many progressives certainly saw it that way at the time, but there are critics and critics of progressive thinking today are alarmed at this because it's saying, well, okay, checks and balances, no, we don't necessarily need that, but it's in the Constitution, right? Written by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin, and it served us well. But getting rid of checks and balances, or at least downplaying them considerably, also means, and this is the main thrust of Wilson's argument here, is that there needs to be more power in the hands of the executive branch, mainly the president. So here is a president saying, hey, our government should be about the president. Who should have the most power in our democracy? The president. And if the Constitution doesn't say that, then the Constitution needs to be altered and changed. Checks and balances, why should the president's power be checked and balanced when that just sort of gets in the way of the necessary cooperation? So he is putting forward a theory that says that our government needs to be driven more from the top down, from the White House, the president down, and less by a sharing of power between the president, the Congress, the Supreme Court, it's the states, etc., etc. So this is in some ways the beginning of what becomes known as the imperial presidency through the 20th century and up till now. And this is one of the main reasons Wilson is considered so significant in our history, putting even aside his role in foreign policy, which is tremendously important as well, but that the presidency is basically gone in his direction. Particularly Democrats have believed ever since that his theory of presidential power, again, the imperial presidency is the phrase often used now, which is a fancy way to say that the president's or the presidency has increasingly taken on more and more control, taken on more and more responsibility, and in some ways pushed other functions, institutions of government aside believing that it was the right thing to do. I mean, some presidents may have just done it as a power grab, but Wilson, I think, firmly believed that this was the best thing for the country and for the public to have a a workable society, allowing human beings to flourish and to make life in America worthwhile. He also, I think, saw the power as attractive as well. Moving sort of down the pecking order here a bit, we get to Robert La Follette, a progressive Republican governor and senator from the state of Wisconsin. And this guy was a mover and shaker in the United States Senate. Again, a progressive Republican. One of the books I've quoted already says, a small-town lawyer and former congressman, he led the movement in Wisconsin, the progressive movement, that is. During his 3 terms as governor, Battling Bob, as they called him, modernized the state government through what became known as the Wisconsin Idea. This state reform program included direct party primaries and improved civil service. Again, a leaning on confidence in expertise, technocrats, bureaucrats, a graduated state income tax, which idea was controversial then and now, a Corrupt Practices Act prohibiting direct corporate contributions to political parties, so regulation of business, labor legislation, kind of the same thing, and a strengthened Railroad Regulatory Commission. Thomas Leonard says that this Wisconsin idea was the first prototype of American administrative government with the administrative state. So it's in Wisconsin at the state level that the administrative state sort of was first put into place as kind of a laboratory experiment and then moved on to the national level from there. Governor La Follette empowered the University of Wisconsin faculty and unleashed them on the state. So a lot of political science professors from Wisconsin University, from other big-name institutions like Johns Hopkins, produced professors, hired professors in the social sciences, economics, which is basically a new discipline, at least in the professionalized sense, sociologists, etc., who were much of the intellectual force behind progressivism, the progressive movement, and certainly the idea of the administrative state and more top-down power in government in the hands of the president and administrative agencies. Hiram Johnson, another progressive Republican, this time a guy from California, who was also a governor and senator from his home state. And Hiram Johnson also has a long, distinguished career in Congress, played a strong role in foreign policy debates as well, which we're not going to get into now. But Johnson, in many ways, can be seen as a classic progressive. He supported the initiative and referendum, helped sort of bring it into being as governor of California. I mentioned that California was among those states at the time that adopted the initiative referendum to inject more direct participation of the citizenry in politics at the state level. One author says Johnson was known as a friend of labor. The measures he had pushed through his first legislature, that of 1911, meaning in California, had been described by Theodore Roosevelt as, quote, the most comprehensive program of constructive legislation ever passed at a single session of any American legislature, blah, blah, blah. 2 years later, the California legislature strode even further along the liberal path. The reforms were largely political, the initiative and referendum, and recall, women's suffrage at the state level in California, before it happened at the national level, a stronger railroad commission, regulation, and so on. Social or economic measures had been limited, in the main, to mild conservation and workmen's compensation acts and to minimum wages for women and children. All of those are classic sort of liberal and progressive reforms of the time. The